And we're going to move on to our next presentation. I would like to introduce ScrapDogs co-owners, Tessa Rosenberry and Davis Saltonstall. You know, we were supposed to all be out at Langley pressing our apples with ScrapDogs group, and you know, I don't know what we're all going to do with the hundreds of thousands of apples now that we've got. Right? It's a huge apple year, but we were sorry that we weren't able to do this. But we hope that we'll be able to do something with ScrapDogs next year. But anyway, Tessa and Davis are going to talk to us about what they do, but very interestingly, why they do it. So I'm going to pass it to ScrapDogs.
Meg, thank you so much for that introduction. We're so excited to be here. Again, we do wish that we could all be out pressing apples and practicing recycling of a resource that would be discarded otherwise. But I guess this will do for now. So it's good to have the company. For all the folks who I have not met yet, my name is Davis Saltonstall. And I'm joined by my partner.
I'm Tessa here.
Yeah, we're the co-founders of ScrapDogs Community Compost.
So a little bit about ScrapDogs, who we are and what we hope to do. Davis and I founded ScrapDogs about 3 years ago, which sounds pretty crazy to us these days. Time flies when you're slinging buckets, as we like to say. Essentially, we are a residential and commercial composting business. So we collect food waste from homes and from restaurants and schools and a few larger food producers. And we work with a dairy farm in Washington, Maine, and we process all of that food waste into compost, which is nutrient rich and a wonderful addition to our local soils, which we'll get talking to. As the screen says, we are not a dog poop pickup service. It is a common misconception. No judgment if that's what you thought, and that's why you're here. But we hope you stick around anyways. Davis and I met when we were living in New York City, so a slightly different ecosystem than here. And we bonded over a love of garbage, which sounds pretty preposterous, but is truly a fascinating subject. It's a really interesting way to think about the world around you when you start thinking about what's going to waste and what's not, and why. We also were brought further together by our big dog, Rhubarb, who's pictured here, and she was even smaller then. She convinced us that the city maybe isn't as much fun as we thought it was, and so she was a push for us to move up north, which is where Davis grew up, by the way. And we're also drawn together by a desire to minimize the impacts of climate change. Of course, we are all here talking today about, all of the impacts that climate change is having on us already, on us and on our watershed locally. From a conservation perspective, we've already heard about the impacts on the Georges River watershed, but just highlighting that sea level rise and biomes shifting, different agricultural and ecosystem conditions that we'll be facing, and changes to habitat for wildlife and the wildlife that is us humans too.
Which is why we tend to see addressing climate change and mitigating climate change by reducing emissions as pretty essential to work for this century. One of the projects that I like to point to as a means of prioritizing all of the different potential actions is called Project Drawdown. If folks haven't heard of it, they have a wonderful website and they issue lots of information. But they've prioritized and listed in this wheel here the different actions and how they correspond to CO2 reductions to meet international targets for warming. And we like to think about our work with ScrapDogs as falling into a couple different components, one of which is reducing food waste, supporting regenerative agriculture, conservation agriculture, and then composting itself, which may seem strange that it's the smaller of those three, but it ends up being the industrial process alone is not where most of the CO2 sequestration and reductions come from. It's actually where it goes. And we can talk about that a little bit more as we go along.
So this is a common kind of structured way of thinking about how to reduce or how to address food waste. Unfortunately, right now, you can see that 35% of all of the food in the US goes to waste, which essentially means it ends up in that red section at the bottom, which falls into largely landfills and incinerators, which I'm sure everyone here knows are not our friends in fighting climate change. Landfilling is essentially responsible for an enormous amount of methane that's emitted into the atmosphere, which is 2,000%, 200 times as potent as a greenhouse gas as carbon dioxide, something like that. I always say I'm not the scientist in the family. It contaminates local water sources, it's space intensive. Unfortunately, we still think about it as the cheapest option because financially speaking, it has a lot of costs that aren't factored in. Same thing with incineration, it's considered an easier option, but on the other hand, produces quite a few harmful chemicals that can be released into our environment. It can also release heat, which unless it's captured, can also have pretty negative effects on our environment. And overall just seems like a pretty irresponsible way of dealing with things. But according to a 2011 Humane study, there's a lot of opportunity. Not all of the materials that are sending to these to landfills and incinerators have to go that way. In fact, about half could end up going to a different use. So talking about food waste, that's where we see organics there on the right. Did someone say composting?
Yeah, I think someone did say compost. So instead of landfilling and incinerating organics specifically, when we compost them, they sequester about 50% of the carbon that would otherwise be emitted into the atmosphere. They also stabilize manures. Little known fact about manure pits, they emit nitrous oxides, which are even 100 times more potent than CO2 as a greenhouse gas. So finding ways to utilize those feedstocks not only sequesters carbon in the product, but also prevents it from being emitted in other means. Compost also builds soil health, nutrient capacity, plant growth. It really is just this incredibly important indicator in terms of organic matter in soil that allows for plants to grow and to sequester greater amounts of carbon as we use fields. So when it comes to that larger pie of what mitigation means, using compost as an essential component of regenerative agriculture as a soil amendment or in conservation agricultural settings, that's where compost has an incredible impact. Some of that actually, I think folks are, although maybe compost isn't directly associated with the hay fields that the land trust is managing. Similar projects like that, maybe even active farms that practice regenerative agriculture are really important too. Regenerative agriculture, as shown here on the slide, is essentially low-till, no-till farming, where the soil is disturbed as little as possible and as much organic material is put back into the soil so that soil health maintains rich dark color and allows for greater carbon sequestration throughout that whole process of feeding people around the country.
So you might have seen in this pyramid, and that there are a few other options for reducing food waste, and wondered why we would show this if we're pretty much at the bottom of the spectrum. There are other, which in many ways prioritize ways of minimizing the amount of food waste that ends up being disposed of. Kind of the next best option above composting is to use that the food that's being wasted, to feed animals. This isn't something right now that ScrapDogs is actively engaging in, but a lot of other composting companies like us integrate animal feeding into their models. So Vermont Composting Company, for example, which many of you might have heard about, they're famous for their 10,000 chickens that they feed with their compost piles. We're really interested in this as a model, and we know a few farmers who are collecting food scraps locally, and we're really interested in how we can play a role in kind of connecting those dots and connecting that food that's being wasted with the opportunity for animals to be eating it. And even better than that, can we be feeding people with that food waste, quote unquote waste? Are there opportunities like, apples that might otherwise just end up as drops to be put towards feeding and nourishing people, especially on a local scale? So unfortunately, as we all know, Cider Day has been canceled for this year, but we are very optimistic that perhaps next year we might be able to make it work. And as far as ScrapDogs goes, we're also really interested in working with a couple of our other, essentially our largest food waste producers, who kind of create one very homogeneous material waste, opportunities for making that waste into a new product. So for example, we work with Heiwa Tofu, the local tofu producers, potentially turning their soy byproduct into another food item, or turning grape chaff from a winery into some other product. So there's lots of creative ways to kind of harness these resources that we think of as waste and put them towards feeding people.
And then on another level, there are also tactics that we can use to reduce food waste that becomes a waste at all, further up in the supply chain or in people's refrigerators. There's an organization called ReFed that has done a lot of work analyzing food waste in general. And the way that they imagine us coming out of food waste as a problem or as a major source of emissions is by reshaping consumer environments so that we are wasting less ourselves, and by diverting those food scraps to composting. So in terms of CO2 reduction, you might actually not think about it this way until you see the data, but reducing portion sizing and creating meal kits are two of the leading strategies for reducing emissions, because they allow farmers to sell direct to customers, size meals and directly with kits that get sent to people's homes, rather than having people's food languish in their refrigerator or languish in a grocery store waiting for somebody to come pick it up. Whereas with diversion, which actually just means diverting material away from landfills and incinerators, composting is the essential option for making sure that food isn't wasted. One of the ways that we participate in this system is actually by launching our own food delivery service. So we bring food from local farms and producers to people's houses. Tessa makes a great recipe card, and we try to build that local market in the same way that is intentionally trying to create a consciousness about that circular system, and while at the same time reducing waste in the supply chain.
And just as a final note, kind of on that topic, we're really proud of the work that we're trying to do through ScrapDogs in terms of reducing food waste, but we're also super excited about the fact that we are tapping into this amazing local food and agriculture system that already exists here in Maine. And there are so many amazing elements of a local food system that kind of help to combat climate change just on kind of a community scale. We already talked about building up healthier soils, and that in turn builds healthier foods for our communities. We talked about reducing emissions from food waste, but it also includes reducing emissions through, conventional agricultural practices, transportation of food, transportation of waste actually also contributes a bit of emissions. It's also a way to think about how do we use our land more effectively and efficiently, and also our water. How do we build greater biodiversity and ecosystem health, getting back to our conservation goals today. And it's also a really powerful way of building a stronger community and community resilience, and making sure that people have that deeper connection to place, and thinking about food and waste and the materials that we're handling every day. It's nice when those can be connected back to this beautiful place that we're living in. So that's all we've got to say today. Thank you so much for listening. Please feel free to reach out anytime through our website, or that's our number. We'd love to connect with you and hear about your connection to this place too.
Yeah, so thank you again. We'll turn it back over to Meg.